Next presentation we have is from Professor Sanil. The topic of his paper is Return of the Thing in Itself. We are starting at, let us say, 2:40, 35 minutes. And I expect a lot of questions from you, so I'll request that you please don't go beyond 40 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Inakshi Mitra and the department for giving me an opportunity to speak. And I am going to speak about the most embarrassing concept in Kant, which is the noumena and thing in itself. And we are doing it while celebrating Kant's 300th birth anniversary. So Kant's city, Königsberg, now the Kaliningrad, they had decided not to celebrate Kant's 300th birth anniversary. The mayor of Kaliningrad said the epistemology and ethics of Kant is the root cause of Ukraine war, right? The chaos it created and the individualism, right? Though the fascists were on him. And we do hope that we will be allowed to celebrate more birthdays of Kant. And this peculiar concept of thing in itself, which Kant says you can only think, it exists, and we don't know. And there was there's not a contemporary legacy, but there was an interesting Indian response, which we already discussed by K.C. Bhattacharya, who will say the noumena cannot be thought, but it can only be known. And there is a spiritual practice of knowing it. And Hiralal Haldar, writing in the British Hegel journals, saying them, when the critique of idealism in Britain is forcing them to give up the idea of absolute knowledge, telling them, don't give up on this concept. We in India, it's just an ordinary concept for us to think. And he quotes Satyam Shivam Sundaram in order to talk about the absolute knowledge. So the real question is, why do you talk about, and this embarrassing? In fact, for example, interesting interpretations like Strawson's bounds of sense shows that it is a very avoidable. You can read critique without having this embarrassed concept. So you can read this concept only when you really want to read a philosopher around an embarrassing concept. This embarrassment is absolutely important for philosophy. For example, concepts like, the Hegelian absolute or Spinoza's God, these are all actually very embarrassing concepts. And how do you think with them? And if you want to do it, you also have to think about philosophy as a discipline of problems. We often say that in a very easy manner, it's all the time questioning, but it has a definite preference for problems over answers. In other words, problem is not a negative condition for an answer, right? Problems are worthwhile in itself, and the task of thinking is not to let the problem degenerate into an answer. Hence, philosophy formulates its questions as paradoxes, so that you don't solve it. And you know that sometimes people solve it. For example, the paradox of induction. So every thinker comes up and formulated more and more difficult manner so that there is philosophy, so that it won't degenerate into solutions. So in fact, Jacobi says, thing in itself is the kind of concept without which it is impossible to enter Kant's system, but with which it is impossible to get out of the system. Right? So if you look at the history of this concept, there are some people say, look, it's an embarrassing, let us exclude it. Or you can read Kant more coherently. Or you say that, look, let's use this concept to attack Kant. Or to think of it as the real point of courage in the Kantian thinking. It's very important today because, now after the linguistic turn, and as what we popularly known as postmodernism, It's the most scandalous concept. We all know that reality is constructed in some manner or not, so there is something called reality in itself. But very interesting is that in contemporary philosophy, that's what I want to point out, there are a couple of initiatives to think this concept again. Right? So I just want to cite a couple of them very quickly. One is what we today call the speculative materialism. The other is something which is known as the object-oriented ontology. The third is psychoanalysis. And another one is the most scandalous things today, which is known as accelerationism, which is a certain way of valorizing technology and by distinguishing between democracy and liberty, essentially a non-democratic politics and a valorization of technology. And there's a formulation of noumena, as Nick Land says, fanged noumena. It's a reality that bites. It's not something, a reality you try to think, but it's a reality that bites. And the last one is what we call the Islamic exotericism, sort of esoteric thinking. There is a materialist metaphysics of people like Reza Negrestani. So I will only talk about the first three of them. So just to go there, that this whole idea that there is a distinction between appearance and something beyond it. And this is a concept which Kant will inherit from the tradition of metaphysics. Now he will mobilize it in order to critique the metaphysics. And it is seen as both there's a negative characterization of as a limit, and then there's a positive characterization of as something which intellectual intuition can actually see. And just to say how majestically is Kant introduces this. Critique is not shallow scoffing at our repeated failures, but an effective determining of the limits in accordance with established principles, inscribing nihil ulterius on these pillars of Hercules, which nature has erected in order that the voyage of reason may be extended no further than the continuous coastline of experience itself, reaches a coast we cannot leave without venturing upon a shoreless ocean, which, after alluring us with ever deceptive prospects, compels us in the end to abandon as hopeless all vexations and tedious endeavors. It's a very grand description. So he says it is like, this is a philosophy of land, right? Kant's critique is transcendental philosophy, a philosophy of land. And he says you go till the end of the land. So the difference between phenomena and noumena are not like the line and on the land and otherwise, but it's the land, you go there and slowly it sinks into ocean. And if you follow that, then you will get into the stormy confusions and storms of the land. And the thing is, so it's a negative concept. It goes like this, and there's an attempt not to think that real 0 point, but it slowly slide away. And those who are interested in the German tradition of philosophy know this land and sea has a great tradition. In Carl Schmitt, when he writes, there are two kinds of philosophies of land and philosophies of sea. And philosophy of sea is the Atlantic liberal democratic societies, and philosophies of the land are the real Nazi, Germanic, or Russian cultures. And then there is Deleuze's the entire idea about geo-philosophy, and an Indian initiative which was taken by Sundar Rajan to talk about the idea about geosophy. Right? So there is a big, here it's very important for us to know this land metaphor in doing it. And so this 0 metaphor of the limit is again interesting, because this will come back in the Western tradition as a question about death. right? For example, you will have in Heidegger, now this death is something which will uniquely individualize you. Or Foucault will say that with the arrival of autopsy, the light of death will now illuminate the dark interiors of the human body, and then Schopenhauer everywhere, right? So this limit is an interesting idea. Now, the response to this idea about limit, right, was one kind of response was the phenomenology, right? And you know, the phenomenology, there is a dialectical phenomenology of Hegel, and there is the analytical philosophy of Husserl. Now, the basic insight of Hegel was that, look, if you say that there is something outside the domain of appearance or knowledge, it is you who push that outside, right? So it is the same resources of reason which has gone into making this cut is that created that outside. So you can map that outside back into us, right? It's easier way to understand it is Hegel asked, that is the time, Hegel's time was this great valorization of Indian classics like Shakuntalam there. And Hegel was telling them, look, the Indians are not very interested in Shakuntalam, right? It's we Germans are interested. So you should actually see what are the power of Germanic reason which has gone into getting excited about it. So the whole idea is that you can map this, what is called pushed outside as the domain of noumena, back into the domain of appearance. So the whole idea about phenomenology is that the essence, the noumena is in the appearance. And you know, Husserl will call the task of phenomenology is to go back to think themselves. Right? So again, another move which phenomenology makes is that this whole idea about noumena is that we are here and this reality is out there, and knowledge is a kind of means or an kind of means in order for me to access the objects, right? So Hegel says, look, that's not the way knowledge is. Knowledge is not a kind of something between you and the object, right? When you talk about object, you talk about this whole thing. Or otherwise, he says that knowledge is not like the refraction of a ray which comes from the object, but it is the ray itself that brings truth to us, right? So here, suppose if you say appearance is something for me, for us, there is thing in itself. Now we will say that, look, thing in itself is for us. That is the formula of phenomenology. So, Paul Ricoeur somewhere says that Kant founded phenomenology but limited it, right? That's the idea about, there's a phenomenology which says domain of appearance, but he will limit it by pushing out something as the noumena. Now, the Professor Hunter referred to that great sage beggar Jew, contemporary of Solomon Maimon, whom Kant apparently gave the Critique of Pure Reason to read. And Maimon says that, look, this is a half-hearted attempt. The critical philosophy need to move to become a speculative philosophy. And let us call speculative philosophy is any philosophy which dares to think the absolute. And metaphysics is a discourse which dares to think the absolute, we can say under the principle of sufficient reason, which says to think the absolute means to think about an absolute entity. Right? So that way that the speculation need not be always metaphysical one. But for Kant, as you know, the philosophy as a critique is a critique which is in crisis. The word critique and crisis has the same etymology. Right? So critical is a medical situation where any attempt to save you can also kill you. And critique is a thinking which is undertaken in that condition. And Kant said the whole thing is actually ending up in paralogism. Now, Hegel says, look, This is actually the bedrock. It is this crisis-ridden subject which is in all these contradictions and all these. This is the opening which you call the noumena. So you can map it on to back to the domain of phenomena itself. And the same thing which is what Husserl will say, that there is all this swirling of appearances, and within that there is this essential object. But this essential object is not something which is hiding behind the appearances, but it is actually the matrix of the visibility itself is that. So these are more or less the same. I'm just pointing out these techniques for how we try to avoid the question about not avoid, you face the question about the noumena, thing in itself, but map it onto the domain of what is for oneself. And actually, if you look at Kant, it's not that Kant wasn't disturbed by this problem. For example, if you read Critique of Judgment, you find out Kant notices that we have this peculiar, our human judgment has this thing called taste, right? And taste actually can pick up beautiful forms which accord with the purposiveness of nature. Right? He notices that, look, nature has a structure, we have a systematic physics. Right? He said, look, there is indeed, we can hope for constructing a systematic physics, even though these appearances are very chaotic, but we know that there is a kind of getting it. And then Hegel will say that, look, you look at a nice sunset, and what is our... Oh, it looks like a painting, right? So that is the kind of mapping function which gives up. And this Kant will not be consoled by this. And later in Opus Posthumum, he will provide proofs for the ether, a peculiar kind of matter, which is not subjected to those a priori intuitions of space. In fact, one of the editors asked him to respond a few queries on the metaphysical foundations of natural sciences. That's the time he says he works out the question about the proof of the ether, where he works out the systematicity of mechanics, and he realizes that we need to move from speed to acceleration, from kinematics to dynamics. We need to bring in the question about force. So there is that systematicity of the mechanics has to somewhere map onto the transcendental conditions for the empirical knowledge of nature. Because transcendental philosophy has to keep this thing that the condition of possibility of the objects of experience are the condition and possibility of the objects themselves. So, this attempt to come up with something called ether. Michelson-Morley experiment will show that there is no ether in this domain of phenomena, but we know it's a peculiar discovery. Nobody is convinced about that. And there's a new physics will now come up where you can reformulate the question about space and time without needing something called ether. But Kant think that, look, you need to, this is the intuition about there is some reality out there which philosophy has to think about it. So you have the thing in itself, Kant proposes it, and then attempt to map that onto the domain of the forest, and Kant himself getting disturbed about it many times during his thing. And it is in this context that we should see what today is an attempt to talk about the thing in itself, right? So one of them is, you must have heard about this Quintian Miyasu's great short book called The Afterlife, After Finitude, where he says, look, what is the idea about Kantian philosophy? Kantian philosophy is proposing this thing in itself because its standpoint is that of human finitude. What is human finitude? Human finitude is the claim that we cannot know reality independent of our relationship with reality. Right? There's no way you can think about, you can access reality independent of our access. Now this access can be many things. You can think about access as body, you think that access as some kind of mental content. You cannot think about the access as something vitalistic. But whatever it is, you need to have an access. In other words, you cannot think about subject or object without having their correlation. Whereas speculative claim is that you can think about reality even if there is no thinking, right? Even if there is no attempt by any. Whereas in the case of Kant, yesterday we talked about during Uday's talk about the empirical transcendental doublet, that is, this whole apparatus is somehow which is the finiteness of the human being, that we have this sensibility. Hence, this correlation is the kind of absolute limitation on the human being to know about it. And it's very interestingly, Quinton Miasio proposes a simple philosophical question. What about archive fossils? Right? Science makes a statement that the universe was, the origin of the universe was some 137 billion years ago. Whereas human being with our finiteness, our perceptual apparatus was only born 2 million years ago. How do you understand this thing? Now, within this human finitude, or anything like the Kantian phenomena noumena thing, we say, look, this is a data for us. We have a certain way of measuring instruments. We have, Euclidean geometry, we have elementary arithmetics, we have the first order logic. It is this which allows us to actually know that, see, there was, for us, it is a reality that there was a universe before us. Right? Quinton Miasio says, look, that's not the case. We need to think about it. In fact, Kant talks about, says things, you can actually think about things which you can't see. For example, you can't ask the question, how do you say that there are inhabitants in moon, right? He asked, how do you say that there are distant stars that I can't see? He asked the question, how can you say that there were historical events? He said, you can say that because it's the extension of our finite cognitive thing that you can just extend it. But we have to say, look, there's a historical limit to your extension because you are not born. This entire apparatus of cognition has a dated history in the history of nature. You can't really do it. And now, the entire idea about time which you find in Kant, as well as the notion of historicity developed later, you cannot mark this moment of the archive fossil in that. Right? So in other words, to say that something is ancient is different from to say that something is really ancestral. And Miyasu was saying that, look, this fossil is ancestral, which cannot be brought into the question of finitude, which the historical is actually proposing. Right? In other words, there is a notion of time which is prior to history, as we understand this. There was a big tradition of in theology. There were Christian theologians who actually believed that, in Christianity there is, I think the man is born first, everything else is later. Then how can there be archive fossil? Actually, the God created these fossils and predated them and planted them there in order to test your faith. Right? And now, this is the real operation of what Kiyosaki called the correlationist way of thinking. Now, what these speculative guys do is, they say there are two kinds of correlation. One is the weak correlation, which is Kant, which says there is an absolute, only thing we can't know about it. But in the domain of appearance, we can never know appearance independent of our relationship appearance. It's a weak one. But there are strong notions of, the correlationism. So one is Hegel is a very strong notion because for Kant, the categories are just picked up on the way. But whereas for Hegel, the categories can actually be deduced, right? But if you take people like Heidegger, Wittgenstein, for them, they say, look, this correlation, which is human finitude, is historically contingent. There's no absolute reason behind it, right? It is absolutely historically contingent. In other words, of course, we have this Kantian apparatus, but there is absolutely necessary historical beginning. In other words, what Kant does is already, it is not a metaphysics because he de-absolutizes the claim of this thing in itself. He says, look, we can't know about it, it is there, it's not contradictory, that's all to it. But when you really say that the correlation is just a fact, the facticity of the correlation is a radical de-absolutization of it. In other words, it is saying that there are other kinds of thinking. There could be, right? For example, the way we see this universe, to know the appearance, is that the only way to see it is, we don't know, right? There could be other ways, but we don't know. Heidegger will say that, look, this one day representation mode of thinking, whether we can ever get out of it, it's only the danger. The danger itself is for the invitation for the saving power. Now, the speculative realists say that, look, if you can say that the facticity of this correlation, in other words, we cannot say why there is Newton's laws are there, whether it's absolutely necessary or just happen to be there for so long like this, we cannot say this. If you are saying that we cannot say this, then you need to commit that that contingency is absolutely necessary, right? So what is the claim of thing in itself is nothing but the absolute necessity of contingency. That's all that it says, right? Now, this is the way in which they try to mobilize the energy of Kant in order to say that we can access the thing in itself independent of our relationship with that. Now, I will just jump to the second initiative, whatever, the object-oriented ontology, which I'm sure many of you might be familiar with. It's associated with the works of Graham Harman and people like Thurston Garcia. Now, they make a symbol. Their take on correlation is that they say relata. We have to think about relata which cannot be exhausted by relations. The contemporary kind of postmodernist kind of thinking is everything is related, right? Now it says, look, you need to think about relata. Relations don't exhaust the relata. Second claim is that they say there is finitude. Like Kant says that you cannot know the thing in itself. They say they generalize this claim and say that, look, no object can know any object fully, right? Every relation, every object can actually relate to only a finite set of the sensible properties of the other objects. So in that case, finitude is a general situation. Finitude is not something between, we human beings are not going to take the entire burden of finitude, right? Finitude is global among every thing. In fact, just to quickly give an example, for the object-oriented ontologies, everything is an object. Right? It's very interesting. They want to say that thing in itself is actually should be thought of as object, right? And everything is an object for them. For example, tables and chairs are objects, Hamlet is an object, Indian currency is an object, climate change is an object, European Union is an object, right? Everything is an object. And for example, something like climate change, you really cannot know climate change fully, right? Now, whether I take printout on both sides of my paper, whether it is going to control global warming or not, there's no way of knowing it, right? Now, this no way of knowing it is not my problem, but it is belonging to the inherent property of that object. It's not. In fact, he has an interesting study of the Dutch East India Company. Right? Dutch India Company is formed. It is formed as an object which at a certain place and and it's very interesting because Leibniz takes Dutch East India Company as an example for a non-object, because it's a bundle of properties. An object-oriented said, no, objects are not bundle of properties. There's something more to that object, right? But what is more to that object is something which withdraws from all the relationships, right? Now, you have heard about this withdrawal symptom in modern philosophy from Heidegger, right? Heidegger says that, look, if I am hammering using a hammer, I look at the hammer, but when I really start doing it, the hammer disappears, right? One is the present at hand. To be is to be present. To us is not the case. The hammer actually withdraws when it becomes something ready to hand, right? And Harman, object-oriented ontologist, generalizes it over all objects. He said every object withdraws, right? The hammer withdraws from the relationship. Heidegger said, people say that, all this knowing that and knowing how, and it is getting into practical network. He says, no, that object actually withdraws from, every object has this thing. At a moment of certain use, certain moment of function, it withdraws from all relationships, right? And actually we can add it up. Actually, he says, look, tools are actually objects. So it's very interesting if you actually try to repeat this with toys, right? Toys are things which radically withdraws. For example, you take a ball or a spinning top, it has no properties, right? You just stand there and rotate, right? As you know, all these have come from the ritual traditions. So it's a kind of radical, withdrawal, and they are not. In fact, one of the object-oriented ontologic, Bogost, has this beautiful book called What Is It to Be Like an Object? Right? It is Nagel's stuff, right? And how do you know? What you know is that you have to make it, you have to do various things and live through its disappearance. Now the third one I want to talk about is return of the thing in itself, is the psychoanalysis. I thought there was a talk after this on Lacan, right? Yeah, so I thought it might be discussed. So I will just quickly mention that, it is associated with Lacan, Zizek, and their reading of the Hegel Kantian tragedy. I think today we have a paper by, Gautam on Hegel is a Kantian, right? So that is the situation. I just want to give a feel of what is it for psychoanalysts to get at this noumena. Here is a statement from Zizek. The real cannot be inscribed, but we inscribe this impossibility itself. We can locate its place, a traumatic place, which causes a series of failures. And Lacan's whole point is that the real is nothing but this impossibility of its inscription. The real is not a transcendent positive entity persisting somewhere beyond the synthetic order, like a hard kernel inaccessible to it, some kind of a Kantian thing in itself. Here it is, like this is a stereotype thing in itself. It is nothing at all, just a void, an emptiness in a symbolic structure. Now, there the idea is that noumena is actually not a thing. Right? Noumena is actually a kind of void and a kind of ontological gap in reality. In other words, whatever is the gap which we are burdening the subject, the noumena thing, psychoanalysts map it onto the object. If phenomenology tried to map it onto the subject, the psychoanalysts will mark it onto the object. And one interesting way to think about it from yesterday's discussion about sublime is that Zizek says, look, if you really want to know thing in itself, it's a sublime object of ideology, right? That is what the thing in itself is, right? And in Kantian, sublime is something to do with the subject, right? It's a kind of awe and wonder and a quickening of faculties of the subject. But here, it is a certain quickening of the object, right? So just let's get a few examples. You must have heard about this whole Greek story between Zeuxis and Parrhasius, two painters. Like Zeuxis actually draws grapes so realistic that the birds come and peck at it. Now Parrhasius, who is a competitor, decides to challenge him. He also draws a painting, invite Zeuxis to come and check. When he came in, he found out that there is this painting with a curtain in front of it. So Parrhasius said, remove the curtain and see it. He went and found out that the curtain itself was painted. Right? 5 minutes, okay. So the curtain hides the fact that there is nothing behind it. Right? In fact, what you mean to look at that reality is that there is nothing for you to do it. Right? See, another typical ideology, there is a certain stereotype where, say, a community X, they are all, say, terrorists. Right? A community Y, say, X are all terrorists. Now, we say that's not right. We will say that, look, there are so many people in the X community which are actually patriots, and there are so many people in the Y community who are actually anti-nationals. Now, do you know the other guy will say, oh, that we all know. But some people in the X community are terrorists because they belong to the X community. Right? It's a totally tautological gesture. So what converts the sublime object is nothing but an ordinary object, subjected to this kind of a formal gesture, where if you actually remove it, there is nothing in it. That is why you say sublime object is an ordinary object. Psychoanalysts say, don't get close to it. It will be really vulgar. Right? It's vulgar, obscene things which are actually the sublime object. So here, what you are saying is the kind of gap between appearance and essence is internal to essence. And what is essence? It is nothing but the self-rupture within the order of appearance. Right? So, suppose if you say that, look, there is an illusion, and you remove the illusion from there, what will be there? Nothing will be there. It's not that there is the thing in itself is the one which is there. No, if you remove the illusion, there's nothing will be there. But that nothing, which is a determined nothing. Right? Now, this Zizek, I will just wind up with, this has give an example of this by saying that in one of the Lubitsch movie, a soldier goes to a cafe and order coffee without cream. Coffee without cream. And the guy says, look, we don't have cream. We have milk. Shall I take coffee without milk? Right? No, you have black coffee, you have coffee without cream, you have coffee without milk. Right? But these are determined nothingness. If you can perceive the difference between these three, that for them is the thing in itself. Now, I will conclude by saying that this thinking is now prompting us to go back to all those people whom we read as postmodernists, like Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, everything, in order to see their daring to think this question about them. But now if you take the other two, the accelerations, etc., who are actually thinking about, for example, their whole idea is something like capitalism, for Nick Land, is the thing in itself. Right? And capitalism is something which is beyond human being. It's only once in a while bites human being, but we shouldn't give a theory about capitalism as a theory of labor. Right? And some people are now saying AI. The issue is that AI is not an imitation of human being, it's something exo-humanity, but when it bites, we will realize what humanity is. Now, all these discussions are now taking place entirely outside academic philosophy. Right? These are on Substack, these are happening on Twitter, right? These are the places where, and Nick Land was part of the Warwick Philosophy Department. They occupied the Center for Cybernetic Research Unit, occupied 2 rooms. They were heavily into drug addiction and intense philosophizing 24 hours. They were kicked out, and finally he went to Shanghai, where actually philosophy is today. From Athens to you quit Jerusalem, you take Athens, then you go to Shanghai. Now, it's very interesting that the legacy of thing in itself is pursued by these cranky people, right? This will be a nice challenge to the Kant, who, you know, that Puritan, who, after read Galen's theory of blood flow, designed a set of clothes hanging safely so that his blood flow will not be affected, right? So this is the legacy of Kant. Thank you.
How would you take your questions? Would you answer from there? Yeah? Thank you. Yes, there's one question there. Yeah. Yeah. Please.
Thank you, Sanil, for this wonderful and very humorous talk. I was just thinking about, like, when you start your lecture with this thing in itself as what was that term?
Could you be louder, please?
What was the term you used? Thing in itself as something.
Embarrassment.
Embarrassment. So, well, I would rather, or I'm inclined to look at Kant from a pre-Kantian tradition. So, I would say, like Descartes, Locke, they all deploy the method of negation, the epistemological negation, in meditation and in Locke. But then they never reach a thing in itself. There are leftovers like res extensa or the primary, secondary qualities and all. And maybe in Berkeley's immaterialism, that is this essay Percipi and the bundle theory, there's a potential thing in itself which Schopenhauer later highlights. Now, the one thing why they didn't produce a thing in itself, I think when it comes to Kant, the transcendental doctrine of elements, there's a twofold negation. So the negation of attributes and the secondary qualia, then space and time. Space and time, even though he doesn't introduce the thing in itself in that part. So my question is, wasn't it this extreme obsession with transcendental philosophy that produced this thing in itself in Kant? And as a kind of, which doesn't belong to the transcendental philosophy because it doesn't orient to the transcendental subject. So just want to ask this.
I think the noumena is Kant's genuine invention. There is no pre-critical idea about. That's what Kant did, because the critical idea about noumena, phenomena, was a metaphysical distinction, right? And it is Kant who came up and said, look, this is going to be, this gap is going to be the real point of critical thinking against metaphysics, right? And that invention, I don't think we will find in the history of thought, a new deployment of this, right? And Deleuze says that Kant's greatest point is he invented idea as a problem, right? For example, in the Western tradition itself, that idea, which was some to be, which is beyond appearance, was given as the word idea, which is actually something appearing, right? In fact, that problem about, idea was made into a genuine problem in Kant. So thing in itself is a problem. I think it's with Kant. And I wouldn't go back to the pre-critical notions about appearance and noumena in order, because this is a genuine, the thing. And the other thing toward nothing is very important, because Kant actually gives you a fourfold question about nothing, right? One is the empty concept without the object, which is the ens rationis, the empty object of a concept, which is the nihil privatum, the empty intuition without an object, which is ens imaginativum, and empty object without a concept, nihil negativum. And it is within that he is pursuing this question about in what way is that the thing in itself absent from us, right? And from him to Hegel to Quinton Miyasu, they are trying to think about what is the nature of that absence. Should we think about this thing in itself as some hardcore kernel which is kept outside from us? And Kant himself faces, look, if you want to think about thinking itself as something kept behind a veil, something kept at a distance, something kept at the distant star, he said all these things can be, there's not a problem. But that's not the problem, right? So there's a genuine problem, and he also formulated it as a problem about how to think the nothing.
Okay, I think if there is no other question, Rajan, yeah. There is one behind there.
My question is about the relationship between Meyasu and Triple O, the object, because interestingly, both of them accuse each other of being a correlationist. For Harman, for example, Meyasu is a Platonist in denial. He's a duo minor. He does both the things at the same time. And when asked for a response, Meyasu's response is sort of, again, gets thing in itself, smuggles it, because he says that these mathematical entities, they're not real, but they point to some dead matter, which again, to me, is just like thing in itself. And then even for Harman, I think Meyasu's point is that it's anthropomorphizing the objects themselves. So it's no real advancement. And I don't know of any speculative realist that hasn't had this accusation that they are still correlationists, but sophisticated correlationists. Do you think that in that sense, this project still has to go beyond Kant? It still hasn't defeated the adversary of correlationism?
Yeah, that's actually a very sensitive diagnosis of the situation, right? Now, when they actually push the correlationist, right, correlation says like there is always this mediation with reality which doesn't give you really hold it, but hold it. They are not saying that correlationism is wrong, right? We cannot get out of, we are humans. We will have this perceptual apparatus. The only thing is that you realize, you think that correlation is already a de-absolutization of thought, right? Hence, push it, right? And make it absolutely absolutized so that you can hold on to that. See, in that sense, the Kantian philosophy can be seen as a humanism. Lot of critiques of Kant which are anti-humanism. But all these speculative, we are inhumanists. Inhumanism is not anti-human. It says, look, we are actually human beings with this finiteness, but we need to relate to our finiteness in a different way. We cannot make this finiteness the basis of our science, our mathematics, and our politics. Now, as you correctly point out, people like Meyasu is mobilizing the resources of mathematics in order to affirm this thing in itself, whereas object-oriented ontology says we should just affirm objects, which are like commonsensical objects, right? Which you pick it up. Look, this is a speculative realism, doesn't use mathematical resources, but it says we can have it for commonsensical objects, right? And somebody might work it out in mystical tradition in another way, but only the task is what you need to access the thing in itself.
Okay, there's one question towards the end, and by the time you reach there, maybe I'll insert one question. Professor Sanil, you started with this issue that Hegel had with Kant. Now, my one small little question is that if noumenon is nothing other than what we make of it, then what happens to the Kantian claim that in itself is beyond the world of appearances? Do you think that we need not go into those discussions to flesh out more about it, and we make these new beginnings that you have talked about? And how will then that affect the old question that we remain bound, our access to thing remains bound by all that is accessible through cognitive structures that we are born with?
They are not saying that there is not the phenomenology doesn't reject the idea about. It's a look for a representation scheme you would need, right? Husserl will say consciousness is always consciousness of, right? They are all trying to take the Kantian dictum that transcendental idealism is the only way to be an empirical realist. The idealist is the only way who can be an empirical realist. But they are saying that, look, this thing in itself, you can always bring it back as thing in itself for us. Right? That is our thing in itself. So then you can map it onto this.
And how will that claim sit with mainstream Kantians, so to say?
No, for Kantians that is not. That's why Kant inaugurated a phenomenology of appearance, but limited it. He said, look, there is something beyond it. You can never map it onto it.
Okay, thank you. That's the last question there.
Actually, I really like your statement when you said the opening of noumena can map the phenomena. That statement really stuck with me. And right now I'm doing research on late Heidegger, and he has fourfold concept: the sky, the earth, heaven, and divinities. Do you think this fourfold concept of Heidegger's later work aligns with your proposal, that it maps the phenomena and it's a opening of noumena?
Yeah, thank you for that. In fact, Heidegger's fourfold was an attempt to think this contingency, right, as belonging to, like, reality is under those pulls, right? So you'll have to think about all that pulls. This is a very dynamic thing, the reality, right? The fourfold. That's the way. That is, in some sense, this idea about event and extra is just trying to say that, look, this could be otherwise. There's no reason why this could be otherwise, right? Now, what the speculative really saying is that it's not enough to say that there is no sufficient reason. You will have to say there is a principle of unreason, right? You have to affirm, which, Kant had, Heidegger has that long discussion on principle of reason, right? Now, but here people are pushing him away. Now, very interesting, as you said, objectorian ontology reworked this fourfold in a different manner, not with Heidegger's, but going back to Husserl and doing a Heidegger on him. Now, the fourfold is this: one is sensual qualities, there is a sensual object, real qualities and real object, right? Then you map space, time, everything into this fourfold. They emerging from this fourfold. That was an attempt, as you are rightly suggesting, to think the Heideggerian thing, to think about the end of metaphysics. Is there anything reality outside the metaphysical approach? Yeah.
Okay, I think there's a student here who has a question that, okay.
Sir, you you took a reference which was like a kind of speculative claim, which says you can think about reality even if you are not thinking. So, is it a sort of denying that cognition requires active synthesis, or are you expanding thinking to include non-reflective modes of awareness as well?
So you mentioned that noumena is not a thing. It's a void and ontological gap. So in psychoanalysis portion you mentioned it, and it was there that psychoanalysis mark it on the object. So my question is, isn't it an indication towards that noumena could be understood in subjective forms or in objective form? Like, if it is projected or it is marked on the object, what could be the nature of it, if I may ask?
In a way, it disturbs the subject-object thing, in the sense of the sublime object of, the void is a kind of void which looks at you. That's the fascination. Ideological objects fascinate you because it drags you up. That's the fascination in it, right? But it's not like the other one which is going, up, the Everest, up and up, you try to find out. Right? So this is, it works it is working at it's not the subject's failure which is doing it, right? But this failure is mapped onto that object itself. That's why it's an ideology, it's an illusion, right? So that's what psychoanalysis is trying to look at, right? Now, for example, the same thing is talked about by object-oriented. See, object-oriented ontology says that two things what we do with any object is either you undermine it, you explain it in terms of atoms and small particles, or you overmine it. That is, you think it was a part of the classroom, it's a society, blah, blah, blah. And the object is something which is irreducible to overmining and undermining. Then what is it? Right? It's a peculiar scaling phenomena. You know, there is this movie called 10 to the Power by Ames, Charles Andre Ames. It's about a person who is in an American park. The camera actually moves out, the power of 10, and moves all the galaxy, everything it goes. And then it goes to the infinitesimal, right? The same thing. Now, what is that thing? Nothing but it is a scalability, right? There's nothing, object or the object is not out there, because out there you will always locate in some undermining, overmining processes, right? But there is something which withdraws from there into this pure scaling process.